Hi, it's Rachelle Abbott, and welcome back to The Standard. The rate of inflation jumped to 3% in January, in a blow to hopes of early further interest rate cuts. The Office for National Statistics revealed that the Consumer Prices Index rose from 2.5% in December to its highest since March last year. Exchequer Secretary to the Treasury, James Murray, told PA that the road towards the government's economic targets will be bumpy.
The Bank of England's been clear that they expected inflation to be slightly higher in the first half of this year, while still being on target to go down towards its 2% target rate. So we know that the road is going to be bumpy towards getting to that target. The Bank of England has been clear about that, but we're confident in our plan for change to make sure that we're kickstarting economic growth by making the reforms that are necessary to boost economic growth right across the country.
The rise on Wednesday exceeded expectations, with City forecasters predicting inflation to be 2.8%.
Today's figures underline the fact that we are in a different world than we were a few years ago under the previous government, where inflation was routinely double digits. But let's be clear, we know that families across the country are still finding it hard to make ends meet, which is why yesterday's data about real wages increasing their fastest rate in 3 years was so welcome, and why putting more money in people's pockets is at the heart of our plan for change to kickstart economic growth.
The Conservatives have accused the UK Chancellor Rachel Reeves of being out of her depth. So why have we seen such a rise? Who will feel the hit most? What does this mean for interest rates? And when do we expect inflation to fall? To unpack all you need to know, we're joined by the London Standard's business editor, Jonathan Prynn. Hi Jonathan, thanks for joining us.
Hi Rach, thanks for asking me.
To kick off, why have we seen such a rise in inflation? Can you walk us through?
Yeah, sure. It is higher than expected, 3%. I think the city had been expecting something around 2.8%. Which doesn't sound a huge margin, but in the world of sort of the bigger picture economy, it's quite a significant miss. And the reason that's driving it appears to be several factors. These are figures for January, just bear that in mind. Fuel prices went up quite sharply over the winter on the back of higher oil prices due to all sorts of reasons, but, situation in the Middle East, all that sort of thing. So that flows through to how much people are paying to fill up their tanks, which is a big expense for a lot of people. Food prices jumped a little bit higher than people expected, around 4%. I'm not quite sure what the reason was for that, but it's a worry because obviously no one can avoid paying for food. It's the ultimate staple that you have to spend money on every month, every day. The other thing that was definitely driving inflation higher, which is more of a one-off, or as a total one-off, is parents having to pay VAT on private school fees. Now, that was a Labour policy that came into effect in January, which is the month these figures cover. And that gave a big boost to the cost of education. Only about 7% of families pay for private education nationally. Most people are in the state sector. But it's part of the basket of goods and services that the ONS, the Office for National Statistics, uses to calculate the overall inflation rate.
And you touched on rising food costs there. Who will feel the hit most?
Well, it's interesting on food because historically, because food is such a staple, it tends to make up a bigger proportion of the monthly expenditure of less well-off people than it does for the more affluent people. So if food is rising, it really hits people on limited budgets. And some surveys have suggested that the price of absolute staples, sort of pasta and baked beans and bread and so on, does historically rise faster than the overall rate of inflation. So unfortunately, it is often people on lowest incomes who are worse hit by rising food prices.
And what has the UK Chancellor Rachel Reeves said?
Well, she said today that her top priority is improving the standard of living for British consumers. And in fact, there is some hope on that because the long cost of living crisis that we had after the pandemic now does seem to have run its course. And although inflation is going up by 3%, wages, as we saw yesterday, are going up by close to 6%. So people are getting better off. The people's standard of living is going up. They will start to feel it in their pay packets, that their pay packets are going up more than prices are, and their pay packets go further. But it takes time for that feeling to get through to people. And at the moment, people are still feeling, there's a certain lack of confidence in the economy. They're tending to sit on their extra pay packet rather than spend it. And that's one of the reasons why the growth figures have been so disappointing, because although people are getting better off, finally, they haven't got the confidence to spend it. And that is holding back the rate of growth, unfortunately.
How are people reacting? The Conservatives have accused Reeves of being out of her depth.
Yeah, they have. I mean, they would say that. It's kind of, usual knee-jerk sort of political reaction. They obviously see Rachel Reeves as a weak link in the government. She's had some bad publicity about her CV and her work experience and so on, and they are trying to drive a wedge between number 10 and number 11. I don't think they'll get very far with that. Prime ministers hate having to sack their chancellors. It's the closest relationship in the cabinet. It sends a terrible signal to the markets that, the government doesn't have faith in the person leading its economic policy. The markets tend to go very wobbly. There's no major policy difference between Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves, so I suspect he will just sit it out. They will both sit it out until things start to get better, which they should do in the second half of the year, hopefully.
Let's go to the ads. In part 2, what does this inflation figure mean for interest rates? If you want to get in touch with us, we'd love to hear from you. Drop us a line at podcasts@standard.co.uk. We'll see you back here in just a moment. Welcome back. Jonathan, do you think this news puts the Chancellor's job at risk?
There are very few precedents for prime ministers actually sacking their chancellors without a fundamental breakdown in that relationship. I can't think of many in my lifetime. Obviously, John Major eventually sacked Norman Lamont after the catastrophe of Black Wednesday and the recession that was happening in the early 90s, but he only did that very reluctantly. And he didn't actually sack him. He offered him another job in the cabinet, which Lamont refused. Obviously, the relationship between Margaret Thatcher and Nigel Lawson eventually broke down irretrievably in the late 80s. But he resigned, I think, rather than was actually sacked. Anyway, this is all ancient history. The point I'm making is that it's very rare for prime ministers to sack their chancellor. So I think, however bad the headlines at the moment, that she will keep her job.
And what does this inflation figure mean for interest rates?
Exactly. I mean, the biggest implication probably for this higher than expected inflation number today is what it means for the outlook for interest rates. Now, we had an interest rate cut this month from 4.75 to 4.5% from the Bank of England. And there have been some hopes that the bank might bring down the cost of borrowing again in March to 4.5%. I think what I'm seeing in the commentary today is that most economists now feel interest rates are much less likely to come down in March. The Bank of England will be more cautious. It doesn't want inflation to get out of control again. So it now looks like the March rate cut, if there ever was going to be one, is definitely on hold. And we're probably looking at May before rates come down another notch.
Finally, when do we expect inflation to fall?
Inflation will continue to rise through the first half of the year. The Bank of England has said it will peak around 3.7%. There's several inflationary one-offs still to come. Water bills are going up by an average of 26% in April. We know that energy bills will be going up by around 5% also in April. And the impact of those two costs will definitely push inflation up well into the threes, possibly towards 4%, which is a uncomfortably high level for the Bank of England. After that, in the second half of the year, it should start to subside again, all other things being equal. The big game changer will be peace in the Middle East and the end of hostilities in Ukraine, both of which are obviously massively uncertain. But if that does happen, it's likely that energy prices will fall dramatically, and that will have a massive knock-on effect on inflation. So fingers crossed, obviously, for all sorts of reasons. We'd like these awful conflicts to end. But just from an economic point of view, it will be very, very good news, not just for the UK, but for the whole world economy.
And that's The Standard. For all the latest news, head to standard.co.uk. Get in touch with us at podcasts@standard.co.uk. This podcast returns tomorrow at 4 p.m. We'll see you then.